Okay, so meanings and definitions part 2. Today's goals are to consider the distinction between analytic and synthetic statements, consider the related distinction between knowledge based on reason and knowledge based on experience, and enhance our ability to analyze and appraise arguments. Making distinctions. Philosophers faced with difficult questions often make distinctions. So they could say, if your question means giving a clear phrasing, then my answer is, but if you're really asking, then my answer is. The ability to formulate various possible meanings of a question is a valuable skill. Many of the questions that confront us are vague or confused. We often have to clarify a question before we can answer it intelligently. Getting clear on a question can be half the battle. Consider this question, in which I underline the tricky word indubitable. Are some beliefs indubitable? What does indubitable here mean? Does it mean not actually doubted, or psychologically impossible to doubt, or irrational to doubt? And what is it to doubt? Is it to refrain from believing, or is it to have some suspicion about the belief, although we might still believe it? And indubitable by whom? By everyone, even crazy people? By all rational persons? By at least some individuals? By me? Our little question hides a sea of ambiguities. Here are 3 of the many things that our little question could be asking. Are there some beliefs that no one has ever refused to believe? To answer this, we need to know whether people in insane asylums sometimes refuse to believe that they exist, or that 2 equals 2. Are there some beliefs that no rational person has suspicions about? To answer this, we'd first have to decide what we mean by rational. Are there some beliefs that some specific individuals are psychologically unable to have any doubts about? Perhaps many are unable to have any doubts about what their name is or where they live. It's risky to answer questions that we don't understand. Unnoticed ambiguities can block communication. Often people are unclear about what they're asking or take another's question in an unintended sense. This is more likely if the discussion goes abstractly without examples. Analytic and synthetic. Immanuel Kant long ago introduced 2 related distinctions that have become influential. He divided statements on the basis of their meaning into analytic and synthetic statements. He divided knowledge on the basis of how it's known into a priori and a posteriori knowledge. We'll consider these distinctions in this section and the next. I'll sketch a standard approach to these Kantian distinctions. Kant gave 2 definitions of analytic statement. 1. An analytic statement is one whose subject contains its predicate. 2. An analytic statement is one that's self-contradictory to deny. Consider these examples and take bachelor to mean unmarried man. A. All bachelors are unmarried. B. If it's raining, then it's raining. Both examples are analytic by definition too, since both are self-contradictory to deny. But only A is analytic by definition 1. In A, the subject bachelor, unmarried man, contains the predicate unmarried, but in B, the subject it doesn't contain the predicate. We'll adopt definition 2, so we define an analytic statement as one that's self-contradictory to deny. Logically necessary truth is another term for the same idea. Such truths are based on logic, the meaning of concepts, or necessary connections between properties. Here are some further analytic statements. 2 equals 2. 1 is greater than 0. All frogs are frogs. If everything is green, then this is green. If there's rain, then there's precipitation. If this is green, then this is colored. By contrast, a synthetic statement is one that's neither analytic nor self-contradictory. Contingent is another term for the same idea. Statements divide into analytic, synthetic, and self-contradictory. Here's an example for each. So for analytic, an example is all bachelors are unmarried. For synthetic, we could say Daniel is a bachelor. For self-contradictory, we can say Daniel is a married bachelor. While there are 3 kinds of statement, there are only 2 kinds of truth, analytic and synthetic. Self-contradictory statements are necessarily false. A priori and a posteriori. Philosophers traditionally distinguish 2 kinds of knowledge. A posteriori, or empirical knowledge, is based on sense experience. A priori, or rational knowledge, is based on reason, not sense experience. Here's an example of each. For a posteriori, we can say, some bachelors are happy. For a priori, we could say, all bachelors are unmarried. While we know both to be true, how we know them differs. We know the first statement from our experience of bachelors, being some bachelors are happy. We've met many bachelors and recall that some have been happy. If we had to justify the truth of this statement to others, we'd appeal to experiential data about bachelors. In contrast, we know the second statement, all bachelors are unmarried, by grasping what it means and seeing that it must be true. If we had to justify the truth of this statement, we wouldn't have to gather experiential data about bachelors. Most knowledge is a posteriori, based on sense experience. Sense experience here covers the 5 outer senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. It also covers inner sense, the awareness of our own thoughts and feelings, and any other experiential access to the truth that we might have, perhaps even mystical experience or extrasensory perception. Logical and mathematical knowledge is generally a priori. To test the validity of an argument, we don't go out and do experiments. Instead, we just think and reason. Sometimes we write things out to help our thinking. The validity tests in this book are rational or a priori methods. Reason, in a narrow sense, in which it contrasts with experience, deals with what we can know a priori. A priori knowledge requires some experience. We can't know that all bachelors are unmarried unless we've learned the concepts involved. This requires experience of language and of married and unmarried humans. And knowing that all bachelors are unmarried requires the experience of thinking. So, a priori knowledge depends somewhat on experience, and thus isn't just something that we're born with, but it still makes sense to call such knowledge a priori. Suppose we've gained the concepts using experience. Then to justify the claim that all bachelors are unmarried, we don't have to appeal to any further experience other than thinking. In particular, we don't have to investigate bachelors to see whether they're all unmarried. David Hume, who thought that all concepts come from experience, defended a priori knowledge. By comparing two empirical concepts, we can sometimes recognize that the empirical conditions that would verify one bachelor would also verify the other unmarried. So by reflecting on our concepts, we can see that all bachelors must be unmarried. Here are some further examples of statements known to be a priori. 2 equals 2, 1 is greater than 0, all frogs are frogs, if everything is green, then this is green, if there's rain, then there's precipitation, if this is green, then this is color. We also gave these as examples of analytic statements. So far, we've only used analytic statements as examples of a priori knowledge, and only synthetic statements as examples of a posteriori knowledge. Some philosophers think there's only one distinction, but drawn in two ways. So they'll think that a priori knowledge equals analytic knowledge, and a posteriori knowledge equals synthetic knowledge. Is this view true? If it's true at all, it's not true just because of how we define the terms. By our definitions, the basis for the analytic/synthetic distinction differs from the basis for the a priori/a posteriori distinction. A statement is analytic or synthetic depending whether its denial is self-contradictory, but knowledge is a posteriori or a priori depending on whether it rests on sense experience. Our definitions leave it open whether the two distinctions coincide. These two combinations are very common: analytic a priori knowledge and synthetic a posteriori knowledge. Most of our knowledge in math and logic is analytic a priori. Most of our everyday and scientific knowledge about the world is synthetic a posteriori. These next two combinations are more controversial: analytic a posteriori knowledge and synthetic a priori knowledge. Can we know any analytic statements a posteriori? It seems that we can. Pi is a little over 3 is presumably an analytic truth that can be known either by a priori calculations, the more precise way to compute pi, or by measuring circles empirically, as the ancient Egyptians did. And it's raining or not raining is an analytic truth that can be known either a priori and justified by truth tables, or by deducing it from the empirical statement it's raining. But perhaps any analytic statement that's known a posteriori also could be known a priori. The biggest issue is this: do we have any synthetic a priori knowledge? This asks whether there's any statement A such that A is synthetic, not self-contradictory either to affirm or to deny. We know A to be true, and our knowledge of A is based on reason and not sense experience. In one sense of the term, an empiricist is one who rejects such knowledge. and who thus limits what we can know by pure reason to analytic statements. By contrast, a rationalist is one who accepts such knowledge, and who thus gives a greater scope to what we can know by pure reason. More broadly, empiricists are those who emphasize a posteriori knowledge, while rationalists are those who emphasize a priori knowledge. Empiricists deny the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge for two reasons. First, it's difficult to understand how there could be such knowledge. Analytic a priori knowledge is fairly easy to grasp. Suppose a statement is true simply because of the meaning and logical relations of the concepts involved. Then we can know it in an a priori fashion by reflecting on these concepts and logical relations. But suppose a statement could logically be either true or false. How could we then possibly know by pure thinking which it is? Second, those who accept synthetic a priori truths differ on what these truths are. They just follow their prejudices and call them deliverances of reason. Rationalists accept synthetic a priori knowledge for two main reasons. First, the opposite view, at least if its claim to be known, seems self-refuting. Consider empiricists who claim to know there is no synthetic a priori knowledge. Now this claim is synthetic. It's not true by how we define the term synthetic and a priori, and it's not self-contradictory to deny. And it would have to be known a priori since we can't justify it by sense experience. So the empiricist's claim would have to be synthetic a priori knowledge, which it rejects. Second, we seem to have synthetic a priori knowledge of ideas like this. If you believe you see an object to be red and have no special reason to doubt your perception, for example, the lighting is strange or you're on mind-altering drugs, then it's reasonable for you to believe that you see an actual red object. This claim is synthetic. It's not true because of how we've defined the terms, and skeptics can deny it without self-contradiction. It's presumably known to be true. If we didn't know such truths, then we couldn't justify any empirical beliefs. And it's known a priori. Empirical knowledge depends on it instead of it depending on empirical knowledge. So we have synthetic a priori knowledge of this claim. So there's synthetic a priori knowledge. The dispute over synthetic a priori knowledge influences how we do philosophy. Can basic ethical principles be known a priori? Empiricists say no. So then we know basic ethical principles, either empirically or not at all. But rationalists can, and often do, think that we know basic ethical truths a priori from reason alone through either intuition or some rational consistency test. So for homework this week, you'll have a 15-question worksheet like we've been doing so far. Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, you can email us at myri.education@gmail.com.
Thanks. My only question is, what are we doing now?